Ladies and gentlemen, Resident Evil Requiem is available for pre-order, and the title, of course, will launch on the 27th of February next year. And we also have some pricing information at $60 and $70 for the base and deluxe edition, respectively. But more importantly, for the sake of this video, we have a better understanding of how it will run on your system. Now, I do want to bring to your attention just briefly that yes, de novo is there. 5 different PC activations is the limit within a day. De novo. I suppose the limit isn't awful, but yeah, I still grit my teeth. Now, with that said, what about the actual requirements? So, there's both good news and bad news. Let's first of all get to the good news. There is no requirement for mesh shaders, variable rate shading, or ray tracing whatsoever. So there's no DirectX 12 Ultimate requirements at all. And so the minimum requirements are actually quite anemic. We'll compare this against Resident Evil 4 and also Silent Hill F. Yes, Silent Hill F is a totally different game engine, but I thought it would be interesting just to take a quick peek. So 16 gigabytes of memory, an i5-8500 or a Ryzen 5 3500. So it's an interesting comparison. And we also have, for the graphics, a GTX 1660, 6 gigabytes, or an RX 5500 XT. And again, I just really want to stress, guys, there is no requirements for mesh shaders, variable rate, or any of that stuff. For the recommended, though, things do pump up a little bit. Again, 16 gigabytes of memory, so that does seem to be a pretty much like a standard now for most PC games, of course. It's nothing astronomical. It also mentions specifically Windows 11, 64-bit required. It'll be interesting regarding Linux and whether Windows 10 is supported. I'm assuming so, but we'll have to wait. As for CPU, the 8700 from Intel or a Ryzen 5 5500, and an RTX 2060 Super 8GB or an RX 6600 from AMD, and again 8GB. Now, a few things immediately caught my attention. The first of which, well, and the most positive, as I've said several times at this point, is ray tracing and stuff isn't required. I'm assuming that we will see this featured quite heavily in the PC versions and stuff, just given what we've seen visually from the game. It looks pretty damn nice. With that said, there are no mentions at all at the moment of PC-specific features. And this does include whether, let's say, DLSS or FSR or XeSS and frame generation, all that jazz that's actually supported in the game. The second point, unfortunately, it doesn't mention, for example, what those recommended system requirements are capable of. Is that 1080p at high settings? Is that 1440p at high settings? What? Who knows? Hopefully that will be clarified a little bit later on. Obviously, you can do stuff to, provide some upscaling anyway, and I've already talked about that for AMD, for example, the smooth motion frames. It's not quite, for NVIDIA, smooth motion frames is not exactly the same thing as regular frame generation, and there are some other cool technologies you can use for upsampling, for example, but certainly not limited to lossless scaling. But obviously, it's not still the same thing as the game supporting it natively. So hopefully we get some clarification there. Although I do imagine that at the very least, FSR will be supported because Resident Evil 4, for example, did support it. And I just want to briefly touch on this, actually. So if we just quickly go to Resident Evil 4, the amount of memory is the same for the recommended. And again, an i7-8700. I'm just going to stick to Intel for this second, because otherwise I'm going to be speaking a lot of the same thing over and over again. So an i7-8700, and again, we have an i7-8700, 16 gigabytes of memory. And if we look at the graphics card, an RX 5700, so it is a little bit higher, just a little bit, I guess, but not much. I mean, it's pretty much the same thing. I would say that the requirements have gone up a little bit, especially the minimums for Requiem. They have certainly increased, especially the RAM, but I don't think 16 gigabytes is unreasonable at this stage. With that said, prices for memory are going up, but mostly DDR5 to my understanding right now. DDR4 is not as bad, and DDR3 is pretty cheap, so yeah. But I did want to also do just a quick comparison for Silent Hill F. Now, yes, it's a totally different game engine, obviously it's Unreal, but oh boy! So the graphics card, an RTX 2080 or an RX 6800 XT, and again 2060 or 6600, so that's massively higher. But an i7 8700, I can't speak, 8700 and 9700. So yeah, for the requirements, particularly on the GPU, the the engine for Silent Hill F is absolutely just way more demanding. And I find it quite actually funny because if we look here, the RX 5700 isn't actually that much worse than, say, the 2060 Super. I think they're roughly on par, essentially speaking. I mean, they're in pretty much the same performance tier. Obviously, the 5700 doesn't support ray tracing, and this does, yada, yada, yada. But it's quite funny that basically the minimum specifications are actually not too far off the recommended in some ways for this. There is no requirements at the moment for the SSD space or any of that. So yeah, I will be very interested. Typically speaking, the RE engine for Resident Evil games does really well. Resident Evil 4 Remake plays extremely well, assuming you've got modest amounts of CPU performance and GPU performance. I don't imagine there's going to be a ton of stutter and stuff like that. So I'm pretty happy. The game looks really cool at the moment. So let me know your thoughts and opinions. Take care of yourselves. Bye for now.